Hi everyone, here we are again, lecture 10.1 and 10.2. The topic of today's lecture is immigrants and refugees. So as last week, I will be posting this online and I will also be posting the slides separately. There's a couple of videos embedded in the lecture. I will not play them throughout the lecture, but please check out the links at the slides. Okay, so we're talking about immigrants and refugees, and the topic of today is sort of an extension of our discussion about globalization and anthropology of globalization. If you recall, we talked about how migration and mobility is one of the main features of globalization, and today we'll focus more specifically on migrations and refugees, but for anthropologists, this topic of migration and refugees brings together a number of themes we've discussed in this class, including identity, nationality, imagined communities, and so on and so forth. So I will start by talking about definitions of three categories that we will talk about, of people that we will talk about: diaspora, immigrants, and refugees. And then I will also talk about pushes and pulls and barriers and bridges to migration. And then I'll also focus a little bit more on migration and remittances, which actually makes the connection between the movement of people and economy. So let's begin with the definition of diaspora. So the term diaspora refers to a scattered population with a common origin or ethnic identity, culture, or religion. This category describes a community with strong transnational ties that are social, cultural, and intra-marriage ties, and sometimes even political sponsorship. And now the term diaspora actually comes originally from the Jewish diaspora in the Mediterranean. Jewish people in the Mediterranean have historically lived through several expulsions from different communities and different states and different empires. So they had to sort of adapt to living in different communities that spoke a different language and had a different religion, but they, over time, they maintained ties with each other over distance, across borders. And so that, to describe that phenomenon, to describe that community, the term diaspora was designated. Nowadays, we use the term to describe a number of communities that behave similarly, communities of migrants dispersed across the globe, such as, for instance, the example of the Indian diaspora. And so these are communities that are still maintaining contact with each other. So it's a term that is now used for a number of communities of migrants abroad. So some of the features of diaspora that may be a little bit different than the other terms we will use is that, okay, so first of all, diaspora has been created through migration. There is a collective memory, right? So people in diaspora, even though they may not have seen each other, there is a sort of shared sense of history, a shared sense of the sort of distant history, but also a shared sense of the most recent history. There's connections, and these connections, there are connections to the country of origin or the imagined country of origin. There is a sense of group consciousness. So people that are part of the diaspora, they feel they're part of the diaspora, right? So it's not just an outsider designation, it's also an insider, an imic designation of the community. And kinship. So there's kinship in the sort of broader sense of feeling that you and the community of your diaspora in another country have something in common. But a lot of times, different diaspora communities also exchange people in marriage, right? So they have marriage across countries. This is actually a slide that I borrowed from the International Organization for Migration, which is an international organization that does a lot of work, both in terms of collecting information, but also policy and aid to different migrant communities. The next definition we will talk about today is the definition of refugees. So I'm using here I'm going to share with you the definition of refugees. That's, again, it's an international definition, and it comes from the 1951 Refugee Convention. The Refugee Convention came into being after World War II, when countries realized that there was a lot of people of different communities that were stranded in different countries. They couldn't go back to their countries for different political reasons. And so this category of refugees was created as a political and legal category that the signatory countries, the countries that signed the convention, have some obligations to protect people that can claim this category. Okay, so let's go to the basic definition first. Owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, and nationality, for reasons of membership of a particular social group or political opinion, this person is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. So that's the definition of refugee. So the idea is that refugees are being persecuted. They can't go back to their country, and this is why they're asking for protection by another country. So I mentioned the history briefly. So the history of this convention and the history of the category of refugees is covered in this book by Hannah Arendt, and the title of the book is doesn't give you a hint that there will be talk about refugees there. The title of the book is The Origins of Totalitarianism. This is a book about the history of the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and former Soviet Union or Russia in the 19th century and 20th century. But an important chapter in this book is a chapter that discusses the origins of the category of refugee and the history of statelessness, the history of people who, for different reasons that are beyond their control, are stateless, means there's no state that they can turn to for their protection. So there's two institutions to know about here. First, there was a League of Nations established in the interwar period after World War I, and this was a precursor to the United Nations, which was then established in 1946. And both organizations were built precisely to deal with these issues that are transnational, so issues of territory, but also issues of people and their identity and their protection and their human rights. So this was the Convention of the Status of Refugees was one of the major documents that were signed by the member countries of the United Nations in 1946. It actually remains the only such document that countries still use to this day, although it's become weaker as more and more countries don't accept refugees or find loopholes around the international legislation. Now, when we think about refugees, a very more contemporary figure, right, contemporary population that fits this category to a T is the Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugees leaving Syria due to conflict or civil war, a lot of them are afraid to go back because they would be persecuted by their government. And so we know that millions of them have migrated or have requested asylum in surrounding areas around Syria, but also in European countries. So this is actually a little bit of an old graph from 2015. And so more refugees have come from them, but this was the peak of the crisis. And you can see here that, there's a lot, the majority of refugees are actually in Turkey and Lebanon, which are two countries that are bordering Syria. Although on the media, we heard a lot about the European countries being inundated. with asylum applications. So asylum is another, it's a more legal term for refugee, right, for seeking refuge. Okay, so the next definition is a definition of migrants. Migrants are people who move also from country to country or even within country, but they're slightly different than refugees, although there is some overlap, that they're not running away from persecution. They're not running away from war or other forms of persecution. It's usually or primarily for the purpose of finding employment or finding a better living condition. So it's seen as something, uh, as a movement by choice, by comparison to refugees, which has more of a imperative and a lack of control and fear of life for life. Now, this again, this data from migration portal shows you the number of people leaving a continent and the number of people going or migrating into a continent. Now, some of these movements can be internal to that continent, but the idea is to see who gets more migrants, who sends more migrants. And you can see here, so the um, purple-ish color shows international migrants, where they live, right? So the incoming country. And then the orange shows where they're coming from, right? So which countries they're coming from. And so the size, it's proportionate to the number of people at a certain scale. So you can tell here, for instance, if you look at Asia, Asia has the largest numbers of both receiving and sending migrants, which is interesting because we think of our country as being a sort of main source of destination for migrants, but you can see from this data that actually people are moving everywhere, from everywhere and to everywhere. Of course, there's a different balance, but here you can also see that there is a sort of almost similar circles in terms of how many people live from the Asia and how many people go to Asia. And what explains that is that a lot of the movement is happening internally. So you have migrants from China going to South Korea, migrants from Vietnam going to Singapore, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this, you can sort of observe or study these slides more depending on what your interests are in terms of the regions and areas in the world. Okay, so migration, right? So I mentioned migration refers very broadly to movement of people from one place to another. There's two general types of migration. One is internal migration, which means people moving within the country. Two examples. One is a sort of classic American example of migration, the great migration to the north from African American population after the Civil War, moving from south to north cities in particular. Another example is just a general example of rural to urban migration. This has been happening in different parts of the world at different times. In the last 50 years or so, we see a really increase of this kind of internal migration in countries of the global south as these countries also urbanize, right, and expand their cities. And the second type of migration is international migration. Again, there's many more examples of this, but the ones that we may be more familiar with is the one of Mexican migrants to the United States. Other kinds that you may not be as familiar with is Indian laborers to the Gulf states. Now, India is an interesting country. It's both a migration sending country, but also a migration receiving country, as it receives migrants from other parts of Asia. And then another example too, it's the North African migrants to Europe. And this has a longer history. It's intensified in the last 10 years and it's been more in the media, but it's a migration that actually first started as a solicitation. So European countries were needing more labor power, and they started to attract guest workers, as they're called. And that initiated this waves of migration. This was in the 70s. And then in the last couple of decades, this has become a different kind of migration, but it's still the same pattern, the same path. So why do people migrate? There's many reasons, but let me just cite some of them. So one of the ways that migrants are categorized is that typically what causes migration is the need for another job or for a job, period, right? But even that, there's different categories that we can think about in terms of what kinds of jobs are migrants doing. So we have labor migrants, and this refers to migrants that are doing unskilled jobs in agriculture, at home, right? So servicing, housekeeping, house cleaning, service workers in general. In construction is another really big area where unskilled laborers are hired. Another category refers to professional migrants, and this is a different kind of migration, like I mentioned with the North African migration of the guest workers. This is actually migration that's solicited and organized by the company. So nurses, doctors, IT professionals are some of the main professions of the professional migrants. And our country, for instance, has different deals with different countries in terms of quotas per country for this type of migration. So we get a lot of nurses and doctors from East Asia and Asia, and a lot of IT professionals, especially from China and India. And the reason being that for those kinds of jobs, sometimes people from educated in other places, in other countries, have actually better education that's needed for those professions. And then another category of migration is entrepreneurial migrants. These are migrants that migrate sort of on their own. They're not going through a program or helped by a company, but when they migrate, they set up shop, they create small businesses. So if you think about, again, United States has a great example of this, many communities that have this niche businesses. So if you think about the Chinese Chinatowns around the country, or the Korean groceries and dry cleaners. Or another one would be African art traders. You see these in cities like New York. So these are, so again, migrants that bring business or they create business of their own, but it's not connected with another company. Okay, so what are some of the pushes and pulls to migration? What makes people leave one country and what draws them into another country? So we've already started talking about this. Some of the pushes for migration are things like poverty, famine, natural disasters, war, ethnic conflict, genocide, disease, and political and religious oppression. Some of these, again, there's an overlap with refugees, but it is these are all good reasons for people to migrate. And what are the pools? Why are people, for instance, going to this country as opposed to that country? So the pools are things like job opportunities. So if people are migrating to look for jobs, then they will go to places that they know they'll find a job in a particular industry. Higher wages. So sometimes people might have jobs, but they're not helping them move, have upward mobility, or get basic, fulfill their basic needs. So people move to places where they can get higher wages. Education opportunities. So people are not just moving just for the jobs, right? They're also moving for things like education opportunities, access to healthcare, investment opportunities, family and friends. So people will go and follow other family and friends that have migrated before them. Media, such as TV, music, or film, plays a role in creating an image of a country and of lifestyle that people then desire to have for themselves. And also on the same boat, consumer-oriented advertising. So, for instance, United States is a good example, again, of this, of having a dominance or hegemony, if you remember this word, from the past, a cultural hegemony over the rest of the world. And that sometimes sort of draws people in who want to be having that same lifestyle that's advertised through these cultural images. Now, what are some of the bridges and barriers to migration? What makes migration harder to complete, and what actually facilitates it? Migration chains are one of the main bridges to migration. What does that refer to? Migration chains refers to social networks of migrants, and they can be kin, they can be friends. They help each other to go from one place A to place B. Communication technology is key for finding out information about immigration policies in one country, finding out contacts there, for knowing where you're going to go, where you're going to stay, where you're going to work, geographic proximity or distance. A lot of migrants will go through land routes to another country, right? Either by driving or walking across a border. Transportation networks, again, where transportation networks are facilitated, that creates a bridge to migration. Government immigration policies. So every government in the world has immigration policies. They're very different from one another. And the way that those policies are will determine or will help or discourage certain groups of people to go to one place or another. So for instance, if you just compare the American immigration policies with Canadian immigration policies, American immigration policy has had several aspects, but the major one was the lottery, which means there's a quota, of course, with a lottery, but it's sort of open-ended. Anyone can apply, anyone can qualify from different countries. There's different quotas, but within those countries, the only thing that matters is that you don't have a criminal record and that you fulfill these other criteria. The Canadian immigration system is more of a point system where actually, in addition to not having a criminal record, it's more of a selection process based on your profession, your education, your professional history and experience, and so on and so forth. So these are two very different immigration policies by countries that have a lot of similarities in other ways, but they then are bridges or barriers to different kinds of migration. Recruitment agencies can also be a bridge. So a lot of places or countries, like as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to professional migrants, different companies will hire recruitment agencies to be able to identify the people that they want to attract as migrants. On a more unlawful level, there's smugglers who also try to help migration cross borders, but smugglers can also be a barrier because they require a lot of money for you to pay to be able to cross. Supportive organizations, usually, as you know, probably from just around your communities, in different countries, there's different supportive organizations for migration, and migrants can go to for help, for finding a job or learning a language or knowing the legal documents that they have to fill out, and so on and so forth. Religious connections or religious communities sometimes support migration. Colonial history, so countries that have histories, colonial ties in the past, have special migration categories for people. So for instance, the UK is a case in point. The UK has special categories of migration for people from countries such as India or Pakistan or Caribbean islands that were their colonies in the past. And so people from those countries can have a sort of a expedited or a different kind of migration application that's based on that colonial history. Language and cultural ties. So a lot of times people will gravitate or will migrate to places that's where their own language is spoken. So for instance, I lived in Canada for 6 years, and I knew that both Toronto and Montreal, two big cities of Canada, have African migrants, but the ones that gravitate towards Toronto are the ones that come from British colonies because their main language is English, and then the ones that go to Montreal, which is part of Quebec, where French is the first language. So the migrants that gravitate there are from French-speaking countries like Morocco and Algeria and other colonial African colonies of France, right? So there's this really interesting interconnections. And then finally, remittances. Remittances is a term that refers to money that migrants sent to their families back home. And a lot of times, the first migrant will send money back, and then that money is used for, let's say, the next person in the family to go. And so this is what becomes a bridge to migration. Speaking of remittances, if we were meeting in person, I would play this short video. It's a TEDx talk by an economist, Dilip Ratha. He's a leading economist in the World Bank, and he works on remittances. So like I said that before, just going to repeat it again, remittances is money sent by a migrant to their families back home. And Ratha in this video talks about both the big picture of remittances, but also the small stories, the stories of himself actually leaving his home, deciding to go to the United States, and to think about those dynamics of migration. But one of the major things that he talks about here is how big remittances are as a number, and they're not counted thoroughly, and they're not treated in a helpful way. So fees for transferring money are really high, all the while remittances are even more in number, in amount, than foreign aid given to countries in need. So in other words, the remittances are a way of development money from the ground up to countries in need. So like I said, remittances is money that migrants send back home. This is an example of how money and social relations are intertwined, because the money is sent through personal networks, is sent to families. And so families, even though they're divided in geographic space, they're actually connected through these remittance sendings, and their ties are strengthened by these financial transfers. And remittances are also another aspect of globalization from below, right? So we've been looking at the globalization from above, corporation, multinational corporations, outsourcing, and so on and so forth. And that actually causes migration, because a lot of times when corporations outsource, they need workers, and those workers typically come from other areas, right? They migrate from rural areas to urban areas. But the other aspect of migration is that those migrants then send money back home to their families in the rural areas. And so they have this other component as development aid for people in need. So this is a really important aspect of globalization, that sort of a grassroots economy, right? Not just a top down, and positive, because it is helping communities that are otherwise not being helped by their governments or by circumstances. And so if you recall, we've talked about hegemony and agency. So migration and migrants here, we can see them through the lens of agency. Migrants are financial agents that are trying to find ways to work around the system, to work against global inequality, which is another problem of globalization that we talked about in the previous week. Now, so I mentioned Dilip Ratha. You'll watch that video. Ratha talks about, he uses a lot of data on migration and remittances. And one of the things that he and other researchers like him have noticed is that even the data on remittances is not complete. It usually just tracks transfers that are more official, such as salaries from temporary migrant workers, or residents of a country that work in an embassy, which is a different kind of migrant, or residents that work for international organizations, and then those who work for foreign companies. But what this data doesn't track, or sometimes it's not possible to track or to include, are the small amounts of remittances that workers from around the world are sending their families. And a lot of times these transfers are not done through banks or through financial institutions, but they're done through person to person networks. And this is what makes it harder to calculate. Okay, so I'm not gonna do the recap here because it's a video and you can just go over the two videos, the 4 videos from this week and last week. But I wanted to give you a heads up on the in-class activity, online activity of this week. So speaking of migration, I'm introducing you to this really nice website called I Am a Migrant Story. So this website takes a very anthropological approach to stories of migrants around the world. So what I want you to do is to first watch this video in the link here. This is a video made with voices and stories and images by Syrian refugees. And then the next thing that I want you to do is to read these 5 short, these are very short stories, it's 2 paragraphs each, of Abba, Joseph Castillo, Christian, Sharon, and Scarlett Rodriguez, 5 migrants in different countries around the world, going from different countries, who tell their own story of migration. Okay, very simple. These are very simple stories, very easy to read. After you read the stories, or as you read the stories, and as you watch the video in the previous slide, please think about what are the pushes and pulls, and the examples of pushes and pulls, and examples of bridges and barriers to migration that these stories talk about. So I want you to, when you're describing these pushes and pulls and bridges and barriers in the worksheet that I will post on Blackboard, I want you to also connect it to the faces of these particular migrants. So for instance, say in Abba's stories, right, we learn about, what pushed Abba to leave his country was X, and one of the pulls to this country was Y, right? So that's how I want you to respond to this in-class activity. And then finally, another opportunity for extra credit assignment. Again, connected to the theme of today, I included here a link to an essay. This is a longer essay. It's not like a short story like the ones before. This is an essay by Hannah Arendt, I mentioned earlier in the lecture. She was a philosopher, political theorist, Jewish political theorist, Jewish German. She was born and grew up in Germany in the turn of the century, and because she was Jewish, she was stripped of her nationality of Germany, and she eventually made her way out of Germany and was a refugee in the United States. So she actually is one of the when she moved to the United States, was one of the first groups of refugees in the world. The convention had been passed. So she has a very personal connection to the Convention of Refugees. But in this paper, she uses her own philosophical and political knowledge to make us think about what does it mean to be a refugee, and to be critical about that, the experience that people who are refugees go through. So this is an opportunity for extra credit. Basically, after you read this, if you want to do an extra credit, you just write a 1-pager and send it to me by email at this point, because we can't do in-person exchanges anymore. Okay, so I'm going to post all of these on Blackboard. This is all the lecture for this week. Please also do the readings from the same chapter on global economy, the section on migration. I've saved that separately on Blackboard. Watch out for the in-class activity or online activity, and please try to fill those out as they come so that they don't accumulate in the end of the semester. Let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week. I hope you're all staying safe and staying in sheltering in place. It looks like we are making some progress because of everyone following the rules. So hopefully we can continue to do this until this madness is over. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions, and take care.